see us as well, okay? So be polite. What we're going to do is, Danah's going to speak, and she's prepared PowerPoints which I'll manipulate so that we can see the slides here and her here, and we'll hear her on the speakers. And then afterwards, we've set up a chat system so that anyone can log in, and the URL is on the front page of the wiki. It looks like this. Oops. So you log into the URL up the top here, and then you can just type in text messages, which she'll also be able to see, so that we can ask her questions afterwards. Or you can ask questions in voice, and I'll type them. Okay. Oh God, no, I've lost the video image. Where's the bit? Okay, I'm full screening you there. So Danah Boyd is a researcher. You're based at Berkeley, aren't you? Yeah. She is doing research on social networks. Howard Rheingold yesterday spoke a little bit about ways in which people connect. Tori Mortensen spoke more about not just blogs, but some of the other ways in which people are finding people with similar interests, regardless of geography. Danah's research is on that. She's right now at a conference in Chicago on collaborative. Oh, I can remember the other. Yeah, but collaborative something. Let me see. I'll speak to you. No, I'll let you explain that afterwards. I'm sorry. And Danah's doing so many interesting things. She has a weblog, which the URL for the URL for that is on the wiki. You can see that. And she travels around doing exciting things, and she's worked at Google and is really one of the people doing some of the most interesting work on social uses of computing. So we're really excited to have her here in video. Okay, what I'm going to do now is mute this so that there's no echo chamber, and then I'll put the speakers on for that.
Good morning. My name is Danah Boyd, as Jill said. I'm a PhD student at the Information Management Program at the University of California, Berkeley. My research addresses various forms of mediated social interaction. Lately, I've been focusing on the practices of blogging, but threaded through the last 4 years of my research is the topic of social networks. My interest in social networks led me to study Friendster as it emerged and spread. It is this application and the emergent phenomenon around it that I will address during the bulk of my talk. But first, I would actually like to reflect on the situation in which we are currently engaged. I've spent the last 6 days at a conference on computer-supported cooperative work. We spoke for many long hours about how technology enables communication and collaboration across far distances. I've spent much of my personal life talking to people around the world. I grew up on Usenet and bulletin boards. And as a professional, I collaborate with folks around the globe. During a recent project, I regularly had teleconferences with colleagues in Japan and Finland, simultaneously, a scheduling nightmare. I spent years setting up televideo for researchers to gather. That said, there's something very odd about this situation. It's 2 a.m. in Chicago. As you can probably see, I'm sitting in a musty hotel room by myself, talking to a camera that is being projected into a different time zone. It is dark outside, and even with all the lights turned on, it is still very dim in here. The Ethernet cable is screwed into, or the Ethernet cord is screwed into the table so that I won't feel it. As a result, I'm sitting at a wooden desk which faces a very large mirror. If I look above the camera, I'm staring at myself in the mirror. If I look below the camera, I'm staring at myself in a captured video screen. No matter what, I see myself. I'm staring, talking into the ether. It's a very, very weird feeling. And it's really hard to resist the temptation to sort of stare at myself and make faces. Because growing up, that's what my brother and I did whenever we saw surveillance cameras or mirrors. I cannot really see you. I have a sort of sense of what's going on out there, but I don't know the temperature of your room, the smell of your morning coffee, the sense of shared presence that you're currently relishing. I understand that if I look down at my notes or look into where you guys are in my screen, I seem to come away from you in actual conversation. My eyes must look like they're darting around, trying to get any sort of information. But in order to wait for feedback, I have to wait for information on iChat or maybe some crazy attention movement from you. It just these little blurbs. It's a very peculiar feeling. As a blogger, one might assume that this is comfortable. After all, I write long treatises and throw them into the wind, never aware of the reactions of my readers, never aware of who my readers are. If I were to invoke Walter Ong, I might argue that it's simply the difference between orality and literacy. Another idea might be that the embodied nature of the presentation is unfamiliar. I have a hard time accepting this, since I'm completely comfortable with the eyesight to talk to friends, or to present full a room when I'm simultaneously broadcast, as long as I'm actually talking to people. The parallel with blogging is actually more strong. After all, I normally project my ideas there, staring in the room alone by myself, maybe with my cat. The difference has to do with audience conception, or at least for me. There's a plausible deniability invoked in blogging. I can convince myself that I write for me and me alone, and I can pretend like I'm shocked when I get feedback. Yet here I am speaking to faceless people, only I'm required by this situation to convince myself that you really do exist, even if I can't see you. In this situation, I have the expectation that I'm just a face to you and you're just an assumption to me. It really kind of brings life to the idea that I'm just a talking head. My reflexivity here has a few purposes. Honestly, it lets me relax into the situation in an attempt to calm my nerves. I'm not an actor, I'm a researcher. Talking to a camera is not a natural position for me. And while I'll be the first to admit that academics can be a bit eccentric, I'm saving the habit of talking to myself for years to come. Hopefully, for my own sake, sharing this perspective also gives you a sense of where I'm at and why this might appear to be odd for you. I have to admit that I need to look down at my notes and slide on the screen, and that might appear that I will look really like I'm not paying attention to you. I promise that I am. Beyond these attempts at naturalizing what is a bit strange for both of us, I want you to consider the role of mediation in different forms of communication and sharing. While this will not be a central topic to my Friendster segment, it is a central topic to my research and all of those who are interested in computer-mediated communication. After all, what is mediation when we aren't sort of used to these kinds of environments? As I give this talk, reflect on how the mediated format of this presentation affects your perception of this content. It certainly affects my ability to give it. What is lost from this adventure? What is gained? How will technology evolve to address this form of mediation? What does it mean to be embodied and not textual in digital computer-communicated medium? Before I go any further, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank you for being so patient with this experiment and presentation, and to thank Jill for playing this game with me. Thanks to technology, I have the honor of being able to speak to you from afar when I can't join you in physical space. Thank you for your patience, time, and attention. Now let's talk about Friendster. So, Jill will move on to pictures. So Friendster was actually developed as a dating site. The goal was that people would be able to go online, find friends of a friend, and sort of find a better community for people to date. The idea is that if you go to a party of sorts, friends are friends and better dating partners than anybody else. So the way this site was created, maybe Jill can actually show an example, is that you would actually have a tool for presenting and articulating who you are through a profile. The profile looks like a lot of other dating sites. You list information. Uh-oh.
What?
Can you see it?
Yeah.
One moment. There we go. So what this image is this is of me, this is my profile, and the profile starts to actually look like other dating sites. So you have an idea of sort of what my key interests are, what music I like, what I might be looking for. You get a portrait sort of saying who I am. Below that, you actually get to see who my friends are. So through the system, I've sort of said the following people are my friends. And I've kind of mapped it out and articulated who those are. And in return, they've agreed that they are indeed my friends. And so as a result, they're on my portrait. Below that, anybody can write a testimonial. Testimonials kind of look like Americans' yearbook signatures. You can sort of say anything you want. The original goal was that you would write sort of why this person is actually dateable, when in fact most people just use it as a way to express their relationship with that person. These are all sort of forms of profile-driven expression. This means that it's a very static representation that in order for it to be updated, people have to put more and more information. For the most part, this kind of stays where it was when you originally created it. Perhaps she'll show different profiles to sort of give an example of it. I noticed she has her own profile there as well as one of Howard. So I'm going to give a little bit of the history of where this evolved as you're looking at the Friendster profiles. The actual program was developed in Silicon Valley by an entrepreneur. It was a small project, and he invited a handful of his friends to join it. It actually quickly spread to San Francisco, and it was positioned actually at a key point in time and a key culture. The thing about San Francisco is that there are all these things that are normally called urban tribes, and there's a book by Ethan Waters on the topic. Urban tribes are small communities of people who gather and have a community amongst one another. They share a lot of interests in common. Because of San Francisco and sort of the migration patterns that are San Francisco, they're overly educated. They often work in tech or other business sectors. And they spend a lot of their time socializing in events that are like dance events, parties, etc. So they often tend to share the same musical culture. It's mostly populations that are between about 22 to about 35. It hit that group first. That group also has a key component to the urban tribes, which is Burning Man. In Nevada, every September, there's an event that happens in the desert. People come and build a ton of art, and they put together community, about 30,000 people worth of a community, right before burning a very big emblem called the Man. So that was one of the first groups that it spread to. Oh, I see Joe. The second group that it spread to was gay men in New York primarily. The third was bloggers and other people online. These groups already had collective identities that they actually brought to Friendster. From there, it spread to Asia. The Asia spread actually came out of Daly City, where there's a huge, which is south of San Francisco, there's a huge component of people from the Philippines and Malaysia. It actually jumped ship, and at this point, the majority of use around Friendster is from Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. It constitutes almost 50% of the use. Most people who are using Friendster at this point are not American, even though that was the origin. The thing to know about these profiles as they were constructed is that they also construct the context. So the people that I was talking about, the urban tribes in San Francisco, they came on and they put up representations of themselves that looked a lot like Burning Man. It looked a lot like the party communities that they were participating in. As a result, when a new person came onto the site, they saw all of their friends having these what are called burner profiles, and they would upload a picture of themselves, also in the desert, wearing fun party clothes, otherwise sort of resembling that context. The same was true for the gay men. And so when people would go online, depending on the friend group that they were in, they actually thought that the entire site was either gay men, or San Francisco Burning Man crowd, or bloggers. People sort of read these profiles in order to figure out the subcultural participation and what people are doing. This is also kind of funny because it allows for wrong signaling. One of the examples that I like to give was my own experience. Mind you, I actually joined the site at the absolute beginning of it. And most of my friends were initially sort of social crowds that I participate with in San Francisco. When a lot of my professional colleagues started coming online, they looked a lot different physically than my friends in San Francisco. Many were men, or most I should say. A lot were older. Many were in their 40s and plus. And the breaking point was a man named Clay Shirky put up a profile of himself, or it was constituted as himself, but what he did was a search for old white balding man. That's sort of how he resembled himself on the site. The funny thing about this profile is that it started to have these two split identities. What this meant was that I started getting emails from people asking me where my porn site was. I was really, really confused about this. Why would people be asking me for my porn site? What people have seen is that actual people who were part of a porn community have started putting up a typical kind of profile. They would put pictures of themselves in those party crowds with their friends, and then they would go and collect all of the people who paid for them, paid for their porn sites. So their actual profiles started to look like two different things: subcultural youth and older white men. So people assumed that any profile that had that context had to be one for a porn site. Methodologically, I actually spent. Hold on.
Dinah, your image for us?
I can't hear you.
Oh. Okay. Your image for us?
Hi.
We
can still hear you, but your image froze. I wonder if you just try to reconnect. Would that be okay?
Okay, no problem.
Okay,
I'm going to pull down.
Yeah. Okay, we're right, we can hear you. Is it weird because you can't hear what our response is?
No, I can't hear anything when your response is.
Are you okay?
It's fun. But all I hear whenever I talk is me. Because of the echo.
Yeah, well, anyway, we're enjoying it, so shall we? Yeah? Oh, some people are asking if we can talk a bit slower.
Sure.
More slowly? Yeah? Okay, any other feedback while we're two-way sound? No, we're enjoying it. I'll mute us again.
Okay. So when I'm starting to look at this research, I actually spent about a year doing types of participant observations. I engaged with people in over 250 surveys and interviews, about 3 dozen interviews, very formal, long-term interviews. I also had 6 focus groups. So I got a lot of data. Plus, because I was logging everything that I was doing, people would send me more and more data. So it was very interesting because I was able to collect information as it spread from different regions. Because at first I was only paying attention to what was going on in the States, and slowly I was able to evolve beyond that. Theoretically, I was actually looking at this in terms of some classic performance theory, particularly Goffman, social networks theory, particularly Feld, McPherson, Burt, and Milgram, and an idea called configuring the user. And I'll explain more of this in a bit. So a lot of people over and over again ask me, what is the point of Friendster? Certainly it was created for dating, and there were actually different kinds of dating that evolved from it. One was what we could have expected as direct pestering. In other words, if I thought a friend of yours was very cute, I might ask you to introduce me to that person. And in this way, you could actually use the network to say, ooh, I'm very interested in your friend. But more familiar patterns were actually under 2 different contexts. One was familiar strangers. So I'd go out and about in San Francisco, and I might meet somebody that I thought was really interesting, but I don't really know them. And I might not even have their name. So what I would see is around sort of this space, and I'd figure, well, if they're going to this kind of environment, they probably know one of my friends. So what I would do on Friendster would be start looking at, clicking through the different sites and trying to find that person based on their image. This was often very successful. It also allowed for different kinds of conversations. On one hand, I could write to them via Friendster and say, wow, I think you're really attractive. You know, I see you around at this bar all the time. I had no idea that you were going out. This was sort of a nice little pickup line that allowed for multiple contexts, which is kind of critical in dating. The other, I could go into the bar and say, oh, wow, you know, I saw you on Friendster and I didn't realize that you also knew a shared friend. Again, allowing for a conversational start, and it's not so simple as, hi, I think you're cute, which usually doesn't get very far. But one of the more entertaining elements around dating that came out of this had to do with hookups. Hookups are the kinds of dating where you don't really want to know the person for very long, often just for sex. What people would do is they would see somebody who was 4 degrees out. In other words, as far out in the network as you can see, because Friendster limited the number of people you could see at any given point. The thing about hookups is that you didn't really want friends of friends to be interacting with you sexually because it might complicate your social relationships. So by knowing that somebody was actually not a friend, it was much better for dating. This was a very funny and peculiar and unexpected form of dating that came out of Friendster. But for the most part, what people were doing with the site was not actually dating. They were using it for kinds of ego surfing, friend surfing. In other words, to try to find friends that, you know, maybe friends from the past, friends that, you know, you hadn't seen from high school or college, friends from work just to see what they were like in their off time. Headhunters also used this to try to see the other side of people that they were hiring for businesses. The other thing you can think of is that profiles, your friends' profiles actually reflect a lot about you. As you're seeing Jill's profile right now, just think about who her friends are and what they're conveying about Jill. The other thing that was kind of interesting to come out of it is that they ended up being permanent representations for people. With over, I think at this point it's 9–10 million people on the site. Needless to say, some of them have actually died since the site was created and since they put up their profiles. What this has meant is some people have these representations and testimonials that kind of leave a trace of them online, who they were and what their culture was about. The other thing that was much more reported in terms of the press was the kind of play and social maintenance activities that were going on. One of the things that I will talk about a little bit more are fakesters and fraudsters. By and large, people were playing with these sites. They were surfing around the sites to find really fun things, anything that kind of made them laugh. Mind you, at the heyday, people were spending 12 hours a day on this service. And you can actually message back and forth with people, through the chat, or through the, it's more like an email box, and it was much better than Hotmail when it was actually speedy. So people would do that to talk to their friends. They were, just surfing around, trying to find anything fun, trying to just meet people, trying to see what people would put up. And as they saw things, they changed their profile. As the site evolved, the play actually turned into troublemaking. One of the things that started happening in Baltimore, Maryland, in the States, was that people started using the service to do drug distribution, particularly cocaine distribution. So people would notify that they were putting together a party, and that party was actually a way for people to come pick up drugs. It was a pretty scary thing to sort of start to see evolve. Another very troubling element of it were neo-Nazis. People, again, mostly in the States, actually mostly out of Idaho, would start searching around for anybody who was of color and send them messages trying to make them go away. People started selling their data online. People started doing anything that they could to sort of create trouble as well as play. So at this point, I'm going to talk about fakesters. And I don't know, Jill, if you can get to the different fakester profiles. Fakesters were a really funny form of profile imagery. So as you saw, people put up typically profiles, pictures of themselves, and decent representation of what they were interested in, although who's to say that it's actually real? Fakesters, on the other hand, actually started having cultural components. So people would put up cultural characters such as Homer Simpson, which you're looking at right now, and then anybody who liked Homer Simpson would connect to Homer in order to sort of say that they were interested in it. Other kinds of cultural characters included Jesus Christ, salt, pepper, anything you could imagine, in order to create community around some sort of shared interest. Another kind of character that emerged were community characters. These were characters that represented a physical space or a community that already existed. For example, I think that you see in Chicago, Illinois right now. So people would put up a profile of Chicago, and anybody who was in Chicago would link to it. Needless to say, this is also how things like Burning Man found one another. This is how Brown University, which is the university I went to, were able to see the alumni for different agencies. You could find people quicker by having some sort of cultural marking. There was also a level of fraudulent behavior. People would create characters that were meant to be real. A good example of this actually comes out of the Philippines, where people would put up profiles of their teachers in order to comment on what they thought of that teacher, writing pretty sordid testimonials. They would put up profiles of TV personas, and in its current version, Friendster actually sells the ability to put up a fake profile of TV personas so that anybody can join in and make money. Originally, fakesters, there was a concept called fakester genocide, because for a while, the service was actually very angry that these fakesters were created. So they went and they killed as many fakesters as they could find. And it was kind of a whack-a-mole game, where one would pop up, tons of people would connect to it, and it would deplete. The original motivation was that it was ruining the network. And there's a certain amount where that was true, because if you were searching for somebody, you would see a lot of fakesters anytime you were searching in the gallery. Originally on Friendster, there was an element at the top section of the page that said, who were the most connected people in your network? Those connected people basically meant the people with the most friends. Things like Burning Man and Ali G and a few other cultural markers ended up being the most connected characters because they could have 3,000, 4,000 friends. They were people who were just sort of representations. People started competing to try to get as many connections as possible, both to be able to see as far into the network as they could, and to sort of play games with what was available. A lot of it was humorous. People, there were two characters for a while called Salt and Pepper. And Salt would write testimonials to Pepper and vice versa, talking about which food they belonged in and which food they should come together on, and how they could create collaboration. The interesting thing, back to the whole point of dating, was that some of the funnest relationships I saw form out of Friendster actually came from two very funny fake characters, fakesters, starting to date one another based on writing all of these funny love stories back and forth, all covered under the mask of characters. Realistically, though, the other thing that fakesters did was they had a political purpose. There was a statement about being configured. Configuring the user is a concept that comes out of the STS community, Science Technology Studies community, thinking about how technology will constrain what people do and try to demand that they engage in exactly this kind of behavior. And whenever users do something that is not expected or not desirable, they're actually forced, they're either killed or they're forced into a set of behaviors that are acceptable. The idea is that the creators of the service are sort of exerting their power, and the users who are trying to actually repurpose it or mold it to meet their needs are no longer given that. The other thing that came out was that none of this is real. There's this assumption that if I connect to all of these people, that I actually know them. When in fact, most of us were actually uncomfortable saying no to anybody. So say that I wanted to be Jill's friend, and Jill didn't want to say no to me. She would just, be like, yeah, sure, I know Dana. And so as a result, the data ended up being more and more fictitious over time. So one of the comments the fakesters were saying was, why should we even pretend that it is real or that the rest of the data is real? By playing with fake data, we can actually start to say, or make a political statement that it isn't real. That social awkwardness is worse than the pseudonymity, which is what I was saying before. Jill doesn't want to say no to me. And so another reason why people use fakesters is they would create a pseudonymic presentation in order to say, this isn't really me, but I'll sort of represent myself this way in order to engage without having to say no to people. More and more, though, it's sort of shared social purposes. Let's see. So none of this is real. The one assumption built into all of these services is that a publicly articulated social network is the same as a behavioral network, is the same as a sociological network. And that's not true. A behavioral-driven network is something like your email, where through a set of behaviors, you're actually building up a huge corpus of data about who you're interacting with. And there are probably people in your life who you don't talk to all the time online, but they actually represent a really critical role in your life. The behavioral-driven networks through things like email are not going to actually represent that, but that's actually what sociological networks get after. They talk to you about who you interact with, and they try to make maps out of this. Publicly articulated social networks, which is what something like Friendster is just sort of who you're willing to say you know. The other thing is these models would build a myth of social network theory, and particularly three different theories by Milgram, Dunbar, and Granovetter. I'm not going to be able to get into it completely, but if you want to look at the papers site on my webpage, you can actually see sort of where that breaks down. One other thing about configuring the users is that, they're being constrained, but whenever you see a new architecture, you see a new social dynamic. What you saw in Friendster was actually people breaking out, using the tool for what they wanted out of the system. So they created an entirely new set of social behaviors that nobody had ever sort of figured would happen before. And they were able to push in the boundaries about what it could be, even when the creators of the site weren't paying attention. One of the examples that I like to give about where the data is inherently wrong has to do with something called structural equivalence. In social network theory, there's an assumption, given this model, that if A and B have a lot of friends in common, that maybe A and B actually should get to know one another, because it's sort of a shared social context. And this is the model for something like dating a friend of a friend. The thing about structural equivalence is that it assumes that A and B might actually sort of know one another, and that's typically true. If you have 4 or 5 friends in common, particularly if they don't actually know each other, there's a high probability that A and B are aware of one another. On Friendster, this would mean that A and B would actually link to each other as friends, because if they're aware of one another, they would probably not say no to each other. The funny thing is that when you see this graphical representation on Friendster, almost always A and B are exes. Ex-lovers, ex-friends. They refuse to talk to one another, and the only reason that they're not linked is because they're angry with one another. Needless to say, that's a bad recommendation for dating. One other issue that I want to bring up that I didn't bring up in the slides is around some consequences that can come out of this. I mentioned sort of the neo-Nazi game that happened, but there's a problem with sort of what it means to have collapsed social context. An example that I like to give comes out of a teacher in San Francisco. 26, so very young as a teacher. She was teaching 16-year-olds in a public school. She created a profile in Friendster in about March of 2003. She created it with all of her social friends. Her profile was really plain. She had a picture of herself with a t-shirt, a big pair of big pants, so some sort of subcultural markers. She was hiking. Her profile, the actual text, was very, very simplistic. She would put up information about the music she liked, sort of her interests, but really nothing that would be too startling. Her friends, on the other hand, saw a lot more sordid data. One of her friends in particular put up a picture of himself wearing a Catholic schoolgirl uniform, probably at a party. And in testimonials, different people were writing about how he liked small girls. It was all meant to be a joke amongst friends, but in fact, this data was far more public than people realized. And in September, when she went back to school, the teacher actually found that her students were coming up to her, and they asked her, "Why are your friends pedophiles? And why do you do drugs?" She was totally taken aback and confused by this sort of information or how they were reading her profile, because they were making assumptions based on what her friends were saying about her own practices, none of which are even remotely accurate, but how could she defend it? They technically shouldn't have actually been on the site. The site is 18 and older. But most youth actually join the site and mark themselves as different ages. So if they're 61, they'll say that, or if they're 16, they'll say that they're 61. If they're 17, they'll say that they're 71, so that they can actually find one another. And a lot of youth will also mark themselves as 69 because it's a fun number. So you can find youth by actually looking for between about 61 and about 84, which is the cap. And that is almost always fixers and youth. That kind of collapsing actually completely disempowered this teacher. Here she was, unable to sort of figure out how to resolve this, right? If she took down her profile, she appeared to be admitting guilt of some sort to her students. If she asked her friends to change the profiles, it made no sense. The friends were there with their friends. If she disconnected to her friends, it was also sort of giving away some kind of guilt. So what she did is she just left Friendster. She didn't know what to do. That's the kind of social awkwardness or vulnerability that is a complication of Friendster. People aren't always aware of how to deal with this. And as this has progressed over time, what you will find is that people have stopped using the service because of a lot of this. People found that they were getting stalked by people from their past that they didn't have any intention of ever seeing again. People were, dealing with bosses or having to resolve sort of very different contextual environments. Again, not very comfortable. And a classic place of anything online, right? Classic case of, I'm sure people have been talking about blogging. What does it mean to have this representation of you online, which is not meant for all the potential readers? So it can be a very disempowering thing. The other way in which it's actually can be disempowering is that, when you want to connect two people, so say that I want to connect Jill with some potential lover, I actually want to be in the middle there because it gives me some sort of social validity. Sort of say, wow, look at me, I've connected two people who, are a great match. And if they're able to sort of meet each other without me as that central figure point, it's very disempowering. That's particularly true around business networks. And one of the ways in which Friendster was part of this phenomenon called the social network service phenomenon is that it, there were a lot more sites created, one of which was LinkedIn, which is entirely for business networking. But it created this very awkward position of when do you want to get credit for being able to connect people? When do you want to actually do it in person? And when do you not even want to be asked? Because part of it is to sort of figure out the appropriate time at the appropriate place. At this point, I think I'm going to pause so there can be questions. And then on the last slide, if you want, there are papers in my blog, which is where you can find a large amount of information. This is a very brief overview and not even deep in the theoretical realm, but on the site, if it's of interest to you, there's a lot more. Now I will wait to see if we can get questions. Are you able to unmute?
Okay, can you bear that, or should I mute this again?
I can bear it for a short bit, but I'd like to hear the questions.
Okay, so Okay.
The lab?
Yeah, that lab thing.
Let's see here.
But I'll take questions.
I'm opening.
And then I'll take questions.
Oh, it won't let me log in.
Okay. So, are there any questions for Dana, like now? Have any of you used Friendster? Well, I know some of you have.
I'd also love to know how people are reacting to this very funny way of presentation. How many people have been in a presentation similar to this?
Oh, yeah. How many people have done a video presentation before? 3, 5, 6.
What is your experience like?
Is this same weird feeling, you know, you say you're on a hotel room in California somewhere, but you know, you could be up here somewhere, or... Yeah. It's this same experience of being there and not being there. It's a kind of absurd kind of reality.
Did you get that? How about the...
No.
So, we had a speaker, a person say that, how do we know you're not a fake star, just down the road or in a hotel across the street?
That's great. I know sometimes I feel like a little character of myself. I can show you. Whatever. There's no postcards I can show you. Oh.
The drain. So I did a really good job of
It's actually funny to think of what these fixtures were over time, because so many of them got so elaborate in the way that people would mix what is real and what is not. One of the problems in the Philippines was that people thought that these representations of teachers were actually true. And what students were doing when they didn't like a teacher would be write pretty horrible things about them, about how they had, sexually molested them in class. They had written sort of screaming fights that they would get into and say, that these teachers were gay, which in that culture is actually illegal. And so originally teachers were getting inquired about due to these presentations on the service. And it was interesting to see how that evolved over time and how people started to take some of it for real or not. And I think one of the tricks, as part of my generation and a lot of people younger than me, we've grown up with these mediated formats. We understand that you have to read between the lines. And it's sort of a trick that has evolved over time. Every time somebody goes through a situation where they are not always aware of what's real and what's not. And it takes going through that experience to figure out how to read the information. I think that's one of the reasons why reality TV show and these sort of blends between media that is real and media that is sort of performed are coming to the forefront right now, because it's something that we're all experiencing as we engage with people in mediated context. If you grow up in IM or instant messenger, how do you know that the person you're IMing with is really that person and not just a friend that's someone who's using that person's computer? It's constantly a problem, and you can hear moments where that breaks, and it's, age-old. I'm sure Howard has mentioned some of the deception games that happen in earlier forms of all of these services. But now at this point where everybody's online, everybody's going through it and kind of playing with that different form. And so one of the reasons why the pictures were so fun is because they were so explicitly fake. And it was actually the behavior of whack-a-mole that turned it to more fraudulent behavior. The first big fraudulent profiles were actually when the site's creator decided that when he killed all of these different people started mocking him. So they would put up a picture of him and create another profile of him and try to talk to his friends in order to convince his friends that maybe they should let the fakesters happen So it created that blurring of the lines, and the more that they were constrained in what they were allowed to do, the more that they actually reached out and caused problematic behaviors.
I'm going to give out a lesson to you. You guys are here because you want to experience digital stuff, right? So log in. What's stopping you? Everyone here has to. If you're not sitting at a computer, sit next to someone with a computer right now. You guys log in. You can make up a name. It can be a pseudonym, and you have to type a sentence. I'm a teacher. Okay, what are you guys doing? You've got to move over there. Move.
Right now.
It's actually fun to see this chat bit. One of the ways that you can think about it, and one of the talk that I gave at 11 a.m. this morning was about back channeling and what back channeling is about. Back channeling is effectively the ability to talk to a group of people while a second conversation or a primary forefront conversation is going on. More and more conferences that I go to, people have this kind of chat-like session going on behind the scenes, where they'll start pointing out links to other things that are going on. They'll start referencing, or they'll start asking questions when something doesn't make sense. And then it engages a conversation amongst the audience, completely disrupting the power situation between the speaker and the audience. Interestingly enough, what ends up happening is this also emerges in classrooms. I don't know how many of you are engaged in teaching in wired classrooms, but it's really funny to watch what happens when students are talking, because you'll see different behaviors for it. For example, when people are actually bored, they'll start getting completely off topic in the back channel. And so it's a way of actually measuring what's going on. But when they're really engaged, they'll start actually giving additional information, cooperative information in the back channel. Back channels, of course, are one of the things that's starting to emerge everywhere in society. I'm sure many of you in the room have mobile phones where you can SMS with people. And what does this mean where you're supposed to be engaged in a conversation right now, but you're also talking with people over SMS or texting? And that's sort of where when you have a culture, which like in the United States, we have an IM culture, people start seeing or having back channels all the time before front conversations, or having multiple conversations at a time. So I have a question in this back channel that asks, do you ever hear of people from the third world, or people who try to make friends over the borders? Interestingly, with Friendster, a lot of the original forming of it was to make friends with people you already knew. What ended up happening though is people would find other people, often through the fakesters, because the fakesters were so comfortable to talk to. If somebody put up a profile of, say, Homer Simpson, you could kind of start laughing, talking about The Simpsons. And particularly for cultural characters that had multiple axes. At this point, third world, one of the things you should know about Friendster is right now it's really bloody slow. This means it's impossible to use. And there's been a lot of other services that have come up from it. Orchid is one that Google has created. And, one of the funny things that emerged out of it was that Brazilians came on board from an original collection of people. And then they found that they could actually create larger and larger groups of friends and start competing with the Americans. So what it meant to compete with the Americans is to try to build or bring more people onto the service than existed in America. There's also, in Friendster, there's no community chat spaces, but where there's sort of one where you can talk just to your friends. But in Orchid, there are all of these little communities, similar to age-old community software. And what it meant is that people started posting. You found sort of a language barrier, because with half the service being from Brazil, everyone was speaking in Portuguese. People got very, very frustrated that that they couldn't understand what was going on, and so it actually created a level of xenophobia online, sort of beginnings of hatred for those damn Brazilians. And so the service is seen over and over again. I know that EverQuest ran into this in Korea. But whether or not people could talk to different people across the world had to do with where their friends were, whether or not they felt comfortable reaching out. Most people talk to people either in their same physical location, fakesters, or people based on where they're traveling. One of the things about those hookups, those dating hookups, is that you would start actually going and finding somebody in, a city in which you are arriving. IRC. It's funny because during today's panel for back channel conversation, we actually broadcast the IRC channel, that was the back channel, up to everybody in the room. And what this meant is you could actually see sort of what these 4-channel back channels are. And it's a matter of where your attention is, whether or not you can actually deal with the different elements. Part of one of the big questions about it is where is your attention going? I notice now that a few people I can see, there's a lot more people looking down at the computer than a few minutes ago. So the question is whether or not, people, are you paying attention to the IRC? The chats are much more fun than looking at my talking head. What IRC for social network? So it's interesting. Social network as a term is really a sociological term. It's a term about how people relate to different people. And it's actually a feature in a ton of applications. And this is often missed by people because this round of things that we're friends is about social networking services. So there are 4 round practices about social networking. But if you think about the address book in your mobile phone, or if you think about the buddy list in your IM client, or you think about sort of your friends on your blog, like your blog roll, these are all forms of social networks. And they're all forms of sort of putting out information about your social network. The first big social network game that I actually did was around email, which I would probably argue came before IRC. And the way in which people would interact with one another, we created a visualization map. I wish I could show it, but I think it's a little hard. But a visualization of all of the friends of friends through your email client. I will actually try to find online in the subreddit of the back channel. Let's see. 1 second. Fortunately, it's harder for me to multitask in terms of talking and searching than I think it is for you guys. So here's a version of it. It's called Social Network Fragments. So here. Friends are the network intended to be social. Are there other kinds of services used socially, even though they were not intended to be? Certainly. I mean, actually, this is a funny joke about all sorts of technologies, right? Email was originally a work application. And over again, what you hear about work applications is that people engage in more social behavior. Usenet was originally set up so that people could ask questions about professional issues. It meant people started finding communities. They talked about knitting, and they talked about any motorcycles, anything that came of interest to them. The assumption is that there's a separation between activity or activity theory type of ideas and sort of social behavior. In fact, most of your social behavior is actually helping you engage in very practical activities. I mean, even in a work setting, the first thing you probably do is, how are you? How was your weekend? This kind of thing, which is about sort of coming up with a common social understanding in order to engage with a work environment. 5 minutes?
Yeah, we're gonna
No problem.
Thank you so much. It was really, I enjoyed it a lot. Did you guys get stuff out of it? Maybe next time set up like everyone has a video camera and you can see everything individually,
That'd be wonderful. I just put my email address into the back channel in case anybody wants to ask any questions offline. And so thank you so much for this experiment and for this fun opportunity to talk to you.